Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar from the National Weather Service in Boston Norton. This is the Summer and Atlantic Tropical Outlook for 2024. My name is Joe Deli Carpini. I'm the Science and Operations Officer. I want to thank Bill Leatham, one of our meteorologists and our climate team lead, for his assistance in creating this presentation. To start, a normal summer includes June, July, and August. That's what we call meteorological summer. And normals are simply 30-year averages. They include the year to year variations, which are a part of Earth's natural climate cycle. And our current normal period is 1991 to 2020. Keep in mind, our weather patterns tend to occur in cycles, usually lasting about several weeks at a time. And our rainfall in the summer tends to be more localized than what we see during the winter time, usually from showers and thunderstorms that can hit one community and not another. Taking a look at some summer average temperatures, we're going to use Blue Hill Observatory in Milton, Massachusetts, which has a very long climate record dating back to the late 1800s. You can see the variation from year to year with highs and lows in the average temperature. But the 15-year trend shown by the black line does show somewhat of an increase in warming, especially in about the last 30 to 40 years. Now, keep in mind the average temperature is just that. It's the average of each day's high and low temperature. Now, if we look at the number of 90-degree days at Blue Hill, you'll see a lot of peaks and valleys in the curve, with some years having maybe more than 15 to 20 90-degree days, and others having as few as maybe two or three. So the 15-year trend, which is shown here by the black line, does show somewhat of an increase in the number of 90-degree days over the past 30 to 40 years. Starting out in the early 1980s, we were averaged about six or seven. And as of last year, the average was closer to about nine. So there has been a little bit of an increase. Looking at our daily numbers over the summer, these are normal high temperatures and low temperatures. You can see this one is for the Hartford area. And you can see in early June, our average temperature in Hartford is pretty much in the 70s. And we warm to a maximum somewhere in the mid 80s, just above 85 degrees by the time we get to mid to late July. And then we start to cool off slightly as we head later into the summer in August. So, what about this summer? Will it be hot and dry, cold and rainy, or maybe something in between? Well, the official outlook from NOAA calls for kind of a warm and wet summer. Notice there's a fairly high odds of above average temperatures here in the Northeast, and to a lesser degree, above average rainfall. You'll see the higher chances are certainly from the Gulf Coast into the Carolinas and Mid Atlantic, but southern New England's kind of right on the edge of that. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see. How things evolve here over the summer. But keep in mind, this is an average over the entire 90-day period, including June, July, and August. So it's not going to capture our extremes. The good news is, from a drought perspective, no drought is predicted, as you can see here. And this is from the combination of recent wet weather from the winter and the spring and the expectation of above average rainfall through the upcoming summer. So the atmosphere works in two modes throughout the year. In the winter, we call what is known as dynamic mode, where we have greater temperature contrasts from north to south, which results in a stronger jet stream. And as a result, there's more energy for weather systems to develop and strengthen. That's where we get our strong coastal storms and nor'easters from. And really, the global weather circulations are dominant. In the summertime, things calm down a little bit. There's less of a temperature contrast from north to south. The jet stream is weaker. Our primary driver for weather systems is called convection, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And those global circulations are certainly less dominant. So in the summer, we're dominated what's called the thermal mode. So what is convection? It's simply warm air rising, cooling, and condensing. So on the left, you can see here's an example. The sun heats the ground. It's known as radiation, and the ground itself can heat the air, what's called conduction. But this warm air rises, and the process is known as convection, where this warmer air again rises, cools, and condenses. And on the right, here's a typical example of what happens in the atmosphere. The warm air rises, it will cool and condense and form clouds. And if there's enough warm air, it can even form into these big cumulus clouds and even thunderstorms. So we always get a question of what are severe thunderstorms, and there's actually a pretty strict definition. They have to have winds of at least 58 miles per hour or greater, or enough to cause damage, produce hail of at least 1 inch in diameter or greater in that case, or produce a tornado. So it's really thunderstorms that produce damage. Think of it that way. So, knowing the difference between a watch and warning is important as well. A watch means conditions are favorable, but the storms haven't developed yet. A warning means the storms have formed and you're in imminent danger of damaging winds or large hail. So, again, a watch means potential. A warning means it's actually happening and you need to take action. So here's a look at severe weather climatology throughout the United States, and you'll notice the darker shades of red, which are the greater occurrences, are certainly outside of the Northeast, more in the plain states, even into the Carolinas and the Tennessee and Ohio valleys. But notice our peak, where you get the darker shadings, really is June and July, and that's where most of our severe weather occurs. It can occur as early as April and May, can occur as late as August and certainly September. Now, on the right, we're looking at severe weather occurrences for different global patterns, El Nino and La Nina. You can see La Nina is on the top, El Nino is on the bottom. And really, for us in the Northeast, not much of a difference either way. Pretty much a lower chance in other areas of the country. Certainly, the darker colors stick out in parts of the southern plains. So let's move on to tropical cyclones. This will be the next part of our talk. And remember that all tropical cyclones have to have a closed circulation, kind of a closed low pressure center. They have thunderstorms around the center, and there's no association with, say, a cold front. Now, in order for these tropical cyclones to form, you have to have two ingredients. One is warm water, which provides the energy. Typically, that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit or greater. And also what's called weak wind shear. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So keep in mind that a tropical depression has winds of up to 39 miles per hour. Between 39 and 63 miles per hour, it's known as a tropical storm and it gets a name. And then if sustained winds reach 64 miles per hour or higher, that's actually a hurricane. And actually, this is a correction. It should be 74 miles per hour, not 64. So our hurricane season starts off in June, and you'll see it ramps up really during the latter part of the summer in response to the ocean water temperatures warming up. The peak of the Atlantic season is right around September 10th. But keep in mind, if we drew a line from about August 28th here, you'd see about two-thirds of the hurricanes actually form after that. So it's really the latter part of August, September, and even into the early part of October when we can see the peak of our tropical storm and hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Now, here's the list of our tropical cyclone names for 2024, starting off with Alberto and working all the way through the alphabet down to William, if we should get that far. So there's your list. These numbers are recycled every 5 years in accordance with the World Meteorological Organization. So these are used worldwide for the Atlantic Basin. And as you may know, the names are retired after a system that may produce significant impacts. So, if you remember one thing about hurricanes in the Atlantic, you want to realize that anything with a name in the Bahamas, which is our circled area here, is really our business here in New England. Note the past historical storm tracks. Many of the storms that impacted southern New England directly had their origins or track through the Bahamas, and you can see they come right up the East Coast and impacted the region, usually fairly quickly. They tend to speed up as well. And we're certainly overdue. Our last landfalling hurricane was Hurricane Bob in 1991. And our last major hurricane, which is a storm of category 3 or greater, was Hurricane Carol in 1954. And ironically, this summer of 2024, we'll be commemorating the 70th anniversary of Hurricane Carol. So it's been 70 years. So for many of us here in New England, we've never experienced a landfalling hurricane. And that's something important to keep in mind. So, taking a look at the hurricane outlook in a little more detail, the one driving factor that does have some influence on hurricane Atlantic activity is La Nina and El Nino. And right now we're transitioning from El Nino, which dominated our winter, to a La Nina. And we'll talk about the potential impacts there as well as its influence on the hurricane outlook. So right now, looking at El Nino and La Nina, the black line indicates where we've been. So the past winter, we were in a very strong El Nino. We're now coming down off the curve a little bit, and we're into more of a neutral pattern here as we're in the early part of June. The expectation for June, July, and August is to eventually transition to a weak La Nina and then maybe a little bit stronger of a La Nina as we get into the fall and the upcoming winter. And you can see that also depicted here by the blue shading here on the right. Here's the June, July, and August expectation with some dark blue in the equatorial Pacific. That's where we measure the strength of El Nino or La Nina. And as we go through the latter part of the year in 2024, you'll notice that blue color really persists across the equatorial Pacific. So La Nina does favor increased hurricane activity in the Atlantic due to the combination of weaker vertical wind shear and also less stability. So what does that mean? Well, wind shear is simply the change in wind direction or wind speed as you go higher up in the atmosphere. So if there's more wind shear, it tends to rip apart tropical storms. The thunderstorms cannot become organized around a center, so it tends to lead to fewer hurricanes. But in a La Nina pattern, the wind shear is much weaker. And stability, when we have lower stability or what's called greater instability, that allows more thunderstorms to form. So think about a typical summer day. We have more instability, we can have more thunderstorms form. So more thunderstorms combined with the weaker wind shear leads to a greater chance of increased hurricane activity in the Atlantic. And it's the opposite for the Pacific. There's stronger wind shear there and a cooler and drier pattern, which leads to fewer thunderstorms. So the forecast for sea surface temperatures is for temperatures to remain above normal through the summer in the tropical Atlantic. You can kind of see a depiction of that here. Notice the darker shades of orange across much of the tropical Atlantic as we head through the summer. Eventually it does cool with as we approach into the fall season, but the expectation is for above normal sea surface temperatures. And that is certainly favorable for increased Atlantic tropical cyclone activity. So the key factors, conditions should be favorable for increased activity this summer. That includes both tropical storms and hurricanes. Again, the combination of La Nina developing during the summer, which is favorable, and the above normal sea surface temperatures. So do keep in mind, though, it is impossible to predict seasonal landfalling storms. That really depends upon weather conditions at the time of development. But it does only take one storm. So you can have an above average year with very few, if any, landfalls, or a below average year with just one landfall. So keep in mind that's something you're going to want to pay attention to during the upcoming hurricane season. So here's the official outlook from NOAA, and notice there's an 85% chance of above normal tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic, and that really goes along with the factors we just talked about. Just a 10% chance of a near normal season and a 5% chance of a below normal season. So odds are certainly kind of stacked up that we'll see above normal activity. That includes 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 which are expected to be hurricanes, and of those, 4 to 7 major hurricanes, again, category 3 or higher. And the averages in the typical season are 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So this is within the highest forecast range of named storms for both hurricanes and major hurricanes. So really, what can we do at this point? We know the odds are favoring, increased activity. Be ready. So now is the time to think about your hurricane plans. And Massachusetts, I have an example here, mass.gov, but also Connecticut, Rhode Island, and other states have a ton of preparedness information. You can also go to ready.gov for information from FEMA. So now's the time to really prepare. Think about, hurricane evacuation zones. You may not live in one, but maybe you work within Boston or Providence or one of the coastal cities, or maybe you go on vacation to the Cape or the islands or down to the Carolinas or Florida. So kind of know before you go, know some of these hurricane evacuation zones. Again, the state emergency management sites are a great resource for that. It's also a good idea to have an emergency kit. Think about items you'd need for about 3 to 5 days that can keep you going without power. Things like food, water, a flashlight, radio, extra batteries, medicine and healthcare equipment, items for pets, children, or other needs. These are things really should be thinking about now before the season gets underway. So we'll quickly talk here about understanding hurricane forecast information. This is always a good refresher. And the National Hurricane Center provides a wealth of information that you can refer to. It's at hurricanes.gov. Starting off, there's the graphical tropical weather outlook. This goes out to actually the next 7 days and also in 2 and 5 day increments. But these are color coded by increasing potential. So systems that have a low potential for development, less than 30%, are outlined in yellow. When there's a medium chance, 30 to 50%, that goes into orange. And a high chance, greater than 50%, is shown here in red. And you can mouse over these particular areas and you'll get information on those particular systems. So when we talk about the forecast cone, this is probably the most well-known and used of all of the tropical forecast information. Keep in mind the cone represents the probable track of the storm, and the cone itself is based upon historical forecast error over the past 5 years. It's not specific to the particular storm. And the track can actually be outside of the cone about one third of the time. Now, important to remember, the cone does not indicate the extent of potential impacts. You can have wind impacts, flooding impacts, or storm surge impacts well outside of this cone. This is just showing you where the center of the storm is likely to track. And you'll notice this year as well, what's new is we not only have the coastal watches and warnings in effect for wind, but also inland extents. So you'll be able to get a better perspective of potential wind impacts from the storm as they are tracked on the cone. So, as I mentioned, new in 2024, we have the inland watches and warnings included. This will be available soon after the advisory, and the National Hurricane Center will also be collecting your feedback during this experimental period. So, look for that on the web. So when we talk about other forecast information, a great resource is the tool time of arrival of tropical storm force winds. And there's two of these available along with the shaded probabilities here. The earliest reasonable, which is when the tropical storm force winds may begin, and the most likely, which is when the tropical storm force winds are actually expected. Now, the good one to use is the earliest reasonable because it's a good to use as a guide for when do I have to be done with my preparation. So it gives you that safety margin. So in this example here, southern Connecticut, the tropical storm force winds would arrive Tuesday at 8 o'clock in the morning and quickly overspread the rest of the area by evening. But in reality, the most likely time was Tuesday evening. But this is just, again, a safety net. When do I need to have my preparations done? So we highly recommend using the earliest reasonable arrival time for that timing. Now, the storm surge forecast indicates how deep storm surge flooding could get in your location. But keep in mind, it's a reasonable worst case scenario designed with safety in mind. It doesn't mean that everywhere is going to see these values. It assumes that somewhere will see these, but it also assumes that the peak surge occurs at high tide, which is very important. So, again, to reiterate, not everyone is going to see these amount of flood depths, but this is what you should prepare for to be safe. Chances are it will be less. Now, when we talk about watches and warnings, we can correlate this to our severe weather program. So, a tornado watch identifies an area where conditions are favorable for severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, so where severe weather is possible. Similarly, a hurricane watch means that hurricane force winds are possible somewhere in this watch area within the next 48 hours, not everywhere, somewhere in the watch area. And a tornado warning means somewhere in this area a tornado is occurring or is expected to occur. It doesn't mean everywhere, it means somewhere in that polygon. And in the same way, a hurricane warning means that hurricane force winds are expected somewhere within the red shaded areas within the next 36 hours. So, again, not everywhere, but somewhere within that warning area. So to find tropical weather information, we have information on our webpage, weather.gov/Boston/tropical. You can also find it by looking at the hurricane icon at the bottom of the page. Notice there are several tabs that contain a lot of useful information, from the outlook information we talked about to active storms to local threats and impacts. So when we get under a watch or a warning, you can look at the local impacts for our area, as well as local text products that greater help define the threat and provide more information. There's also satellite, radar, and social media information, as well as preparedness and other links for you to use. So again, weather.gov/Boston/tropical contains really all the information that you need for the tropical season. So we need to ask ourselves now, before the season gets underway, can we stand on our own 2 feet for 2 to 3 days after a major hurricane strike? Keep in mind, there could be widespread down trees and wires, as well as flooding, which could cut off access to certain areas. And can we deal with widespread and long duration loss of utilities? Keep in mind, power outages with a landfalling hurricane could last for several weeks. If you remember Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, power was out for 1 to 2 weeks in some locations, and that was just a tropical storm. Think about loss of phone and communications, cell towers today. Carroll in 1954 took all of the phone communications in Rhode Island down for several weeks. So you'll need to be self sustaining before federal resources swing into action. Remember, you won't be the only one needing help. Many communities will need help. So the more pre planning you do now, the less stressful the event will be. So we strongly encourage going to your state's emergency management site or ready.gov to really get ready for this upcoming hurricane season. So, in summary, conditions are favorable for above normal Atlantic tropical activity this summer. That's due to the expectation of La Nina developing, as well as record warm sea surface temperatures. And for the summer overall, odds are favoring a warmer than normal summer and to a lesser degree above normal rainfall. So that warm and wet signal is kind of what's being keyed on for this upcoming summer. So I thank you for joining us on our webinar for the Summer and Atlantic Tropical Outlook for 2024. If you have any questions or want to provide some feedback, you can send me an email. You're welcome to do that anytime. My email is joseph.delicarpini@noaa.gov. Thanks for listening.